With war now waging on multiple fronts, what do we see? We see that there is now calls to withdraw funding from Ukraine, not only from the Republicans, but from the Democrats, and even within that of the upper echelon of the structure of the world empire, within that of the military-industrial complex itself. John Kirby recently announcing that we will not be having limitless funding to Ukraine anymore, and we will have to pull that to a halt. And why is that? Because we can't fund a war with Israel versus Hamas, and nor a war with America versus Russia, America versus China, China versus Taiwan, or America versus Iran if we're consistently funding the war in Ukraine like we have been. It appears that this endless money sink for the military-industrial complex is finally coming to an end. Let's go ahead and jump into what's going on. A great way to start this off would be with Colonel Douglas Macgregor, so I figured that's where our jumping off point will be. He said, will Americans continue to support escalating proxy wars in Ukraine, a byproduct of Washington's pursuit of global hegemony, or will America demand that Washington defend America's borders and maintain a republic that upholds the rule of law, respect the cultures and traditions of nations different from us, and trade freely with all nations as it protects American economic prosperity, its commerce, and its citizens? Well, here's the deal. The people in the foreign policy establishment and the upper echelons of the military-industrial complex and the higher seats of power within American politics and government, they don't care. They don't care about what's best for the American economy, American prosperity, or its commerce. They care about the expansion of the global empire, and they will gladly see every single person in America impoverished as long as it means that they can get richer to avoid the problems that are befalling every single person. Because they don't care. They will gladly sacrifice you, your brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, your sisters and brothers to the warfare state, to the meat grinder, so they can be sacrificed so nation states can acquire more land to submit it to the military-industrial complex and the war machine. That is the nature of what we are talking about here. Now let's go ahead and jump on into Citizen Free Press. In case you missed this bombshell, John Kirby announced that funding for Ukraine is coming near to the end of the rope. Let's go ahead and get into this. And just before we do, I want to cover that Colonel Douglas Macgregor had an interview with Tucker Carlson that was fantastic. That will be linked in the description down below, as per usual, as will everything that I use in every single video. Let's go ahead and get into this clip.
Thanks. Just to follow up on Brian's question, I know contours of the congressional package is still taking shape, but can you provide us anything on a timeline or give us a sense of how quickly the U.S. would exhaust what it can provide to Israel before congressional action is needed?
We have existing authorities and appropriations to support Israel in the near term. And I got asked last time, what does near term or what's a bit mean? I can't give you a date certain on the calendar because a lot of it's going to depend on their expenditure rate and what the replenishment ability is, or what the need is, and what our ability to do it is. But in the near term, we've got appropriations and authorities for both Ukraine and for Israel. But you don't want to be trying to bake in long-term support when you're at the end of the rope. And in Ukraine, on the Ukraine funding, we're coming near to the end of the rope. I mean, today we announced $200 million. And we'll keep that aid going as long as we can, but it's not going to be indefinite. So are we moving with a sense of alacrity? Absolutely. I couldn't.
Isn't that fascinating? Right as another conflict arises, what do we see? We see funding for one diminish, because even with the fact of the world empire having what appears to be limitless funding, with that of the Federal Reserve being that of the Leviathan, that is nothing more than the lifeblood of this empire, because it gives them the endless fiat to push any of the standards they want. What do we see? Even with that, they still can't fund every single side of every single war. Let's go ahead, jump in more to Disclose TV. U.S. defense stocks surge amid Israel-Gaza war. Isn't that fascinating? And if you think this is the only time this has happened, well, I have a bridge to sell you, my friend. Because I guarantee you it looked exactly the same when what we saw happen with the Ukraine conflict and the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. Because who profits most? Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and companies such as this. Because the money is nothing more than a circular loop, because the argument could be made that this is nothing more than a money laundering scheme to bring money all the way back to the major facilities that are the huge byproducts of the military-industrial complex, then provide resources to then consistently fuel these wars that will then only provide further support for them. And then we see the political arm of the United States government and the world empire also doing their bidding to try and go ahead and gin up these conflicts. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now we see, this is from Caitlin Johnstone. She says, CNN's Aaron Burnett adding to the mad rush to normalize war profiteering in Ukraine by explaining that the vast majority of this money is going to American companies and jobs. Now, let's go ahead and jump into this. I thought this was beyond fascinating and well worth covering, and this is the thing that spawned this entire segment.
It's worthwhile with all of this gaining, some steam and public perception to be clear on some facts. First and foremost, the vast majority of this money is going to American companies and jobs, right? Because those are the people who are making the Abrams tanks, the ammo, and everything else. And we take Lockheed Martin, which makes the HIMARS that have been core to Ukraine's counteroffensive. The company announced it's going to increase its workforce in Camden, Arkansas by 20% just because of this new demand.
Wow, would you look at that? It looks like war creates demand for the war in the military-industrial complex because we will consistently be able to fund and fuel, more war, which will only then consistently give us more business. It's so simple, it's so obvious, and this woman cannot even see the link between the two dots. It's unbelievable. But granted, when you are stuck in this mindset of being the blue-pilled propagandist that is the journalist class, I don't even know if you have the capacity to see the nature of what's really happening here. Let's go on, and here we see Mario Nafwal, and this is a report of Zelensky saying there is a risk that the international attention will turn away from Ukraine amid the Israel-Gaza war. Well, isn't that fascinating? Zelensky freaking out about the fact that, no, we need more money, we need more funding. And I understand he's talking about the prospects of defending his land, and he wants to make sure that the Russians can't encroach upon it. But here's the deal. It was never the United States' business to get involved in this conflict. NATO made a deal with Vladimir Putin to make sure that there would be no NATO enlargement and no expansion towards Russia's borders or to acquire any of the satellite states that are around Russia that were once post-Soviet territories. And what do we see? Consistent NATO expansion has led to the process of this war's escalation, which is what led to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now we go on to Luke Rudkowski saying the loudest pro-war voices are usually coming from the most cowardly individuals. All the war propaganda, all the screaming, and all the lies, the hatred, comes invariably from people who are not fighting. And the first thing that comes to mind when I think of this is Ben Shapiro and how consistent and rampant his bloodthirsty warmongering has been since this conflict kicked off with Israel and Palestine. I understand Ben Shapiro is very much aligned with his Jewish faith and his Jewish identity, but here's the thing. Ben Shapiro spent his entire time in political commentary attacking identity politics, only to flip the script immediately anytime Israel comes into the conversation and play identity politics about his Jewish identity. Now, Jack Posobiec says it's crazy how the Israeli war ended the Ukraine war. And that's so true. As we've already covered, we saw John Kirby talking about the fact that we're going to have to curtail this funding because we're going to have to limit what we're giving to Ukraine because we have this new conflict on the horizon. And they don't explain what that new conflict is because it could be them pushing up conflict by funding Taiwan against their onslaught of what China is going to be pushing with the consistent military drills and the possible expansion of China and acquisition of Taiwan by the Chinese Communist Party. Well, it could be the idea of the United States fighting a war with Iran because of Iran's funding of Hezbollah and Hezbollah's apparent funding of what is going on with the recent attack through Gaza into Israel by the Hamas terrorist group. Isn't that just fascinating? There's so many different angles and wars that this could be pushed into. It's almost like they're just waiting for the next conflict that they can goose step us into to make sure that the military-industrial complex can consistently keep that gravy train rolling. Now on to Russians with attitude, and I don't even know who Russians with attitude is. I just thought this was a good point, so I figured to throw it up. The combination of Ukraine completely normalizing routinely using their own citizens as human shields, and Israel completely normalizing disregarding the presence of civilians during a ruthless air campaign means that civilians will have it really, really bad in the next big war. Gaza is relatively small, and the SMO doesn't have racial hatred as a factor. At least one side of the country with all of the bombs and missiles does. And here's the deal. There is complete racial hatred on both sides of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. The idea that we would ignore one side's transgressions or one side's actions against the other would completely remove the historical context of what has led to this conflict and the state that it is in now, with all of the death and decay that is now taking place within Gaza and within the Israeli border. All right. We're going to go ahead and get on to Jackson Hinkle, who was recently just banned for telling the truth about what is going on with the Ukraine war. He was banned on YouTube. You can go find him now on Rumble or on Twitter. His Twitter will be linked in the description down below. Jackson is quite fascinating. I disagree with him on the ideas of American communism. I really think he's so wrong about that. It's unbelievable. But he's clearly a man of history. He's very well read, and he's quite intelligent and well worth listening to, despite of the fact that you disagree with him on some things. I will never understand the ideal of ostracizing someone from the collective debate that is happening in civil society unless you want to rip that person's tongue out so they cannot talk because you don't want people to hear what they have to say. Jackson says if Putin weaponized Ukraine's water supply, they'd call him a war criminal. When Netanyahu weaponizes Gaza's water supply, they call him pragmatic. The war pigs are exposing themselves. Absolutely right. The hypocrisy is on full display. And now, onto the hypocrisy, we see people like Janet Yellen, who consistently talks about the fact that we can just print more money, we can fund more government projects, and every single turn, she's wrong. She's wrong every single time. And she talks out of both sides of her mouth at every single turn because she's only trying to come out on top. And this is something that government does perfectly, is play both sides of a conflict so they can always come out on top. If you need any proof of that, just go look at the history of what is going on with the Middle East. All right. David Brady says, we paid for wars in Afghanistan and Iraq with zero interest rate policy in a 2008 recession. Are you prepared to pay for Ukraine and Israel with your jobs and your homes? And this is in response to Janet Yellen saying the U.S. can certainly afford to fund wars in both Israel and Ukraine. She said the American economy is doing extremely well. Well, here's the deal. When you go to the grocery store and you go buy your eggs and your meat and you buy every single thing else that you buy from the store, and then you go and you get your gas and you go home and then you look at your balance of your bank account, do you feel like the American economy is doing great? Do you feel like you're doing better than you were before the past 8 years of absolute abject destruction that took place throughout the consistency of all of American life, whether it was the culture, whether it was the economy, whether it was the handling of COVID and how that was completely blown out of proportion and annihilated so many people's capacity to move upward through the economic ladder? No, these people think everything is just absolutely fine.
What this all means. Paul Tudor-Jones, the famed investor, was on CNBC this week, and he said, this is the most threatening and challenging geopolitical environment that I've ever seen. At the same time, the US is in its weakest fiscal position since World War II, with debt to GDP at 122%. Can America, can the West afford another war at this time?
I think the answer is absolutely. America can certainly afford to stand with Israel and to support Israel's military needs. And we also can and must support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. And look, the American economy is doing extremely well.
What this all means.
So the American economy is doing extremely well. We must support and fund every single one of these wars to the nth degree. We must fund them endlessly. And well, what do we see? We see once again the people who are speaking the loudest about funding war, which will lead to nothing more than the death of innocent civilians, being the people who absolutely will not go fight it. They are sitting there moving pawns across the chessboard as they sit there and laugh as you get kicked over and thrown into the dustbin of history because your name will be forgotten, but you can guarantee that these fucking criminals, gotta watch what I'm about to say when I'm talking about these people, will absolutely be remembered in the way that I pray they are remembered as nothing more than the people who destroyed one of the greatest nations on earth. Let's go ahead and continue on. Joe Biden has to say something that I thought so fascinating because he tweeted this out and he said, "We're the most powerful nation in the history of the world. We can take care of Israel and Ukraine and still maintain our overall international defense." So, we have to maintain our overall international defense, our monitoring of 800 military bases abroad. We have to fund wars in Ukraine. We have to fund wars in Israel against Hamas. We are also going to have to make sure we are activated against a conflict with Taiwan and China, and making sure we are paying attention to the prospects of a conflict with Iran. But we can fund absolutely everything. These people have no concept of how money works.
Are the wars in Israel and Ukraine more than the United States can take on at the same time?
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense.
We can take care of both of these and maintain our overall international defense. And who is it that they are talking about that we can use to take care of this? Well, it's you, as I've already stated. Your brothers and sisters, your sons and daughters, your mothers and fathers, your aunts and uncles, and every single other person that you know and love that will gladly sacrifice to the war machine. Let's go ahead and jump into a couple articles where we're going to be covering what's going on the ground in Ukraine and see the nature of the conflict and how it has completely destroyed this landscape. We're going to be starting off with Kiev Independent. Zelensky, almost a third of Ukrainian territory unsafe due to mines and unexploded ordnance. He said this in an evening address on October 14th. Isn't that fascinating? So, even though this entire land is not only completely decimated throughout the context of all of the historical invasion and bombardment that it has received, throughout the decades, generations, and if we're being honest, centuries of conflict that has befallen this land, well, what do we see? Now, there are many portions of it that are completely unlivable due to the mines and explosives that are completely littered throughout the entirety of this area. And what does that mean? It means a large portion of where many of these peoples would have gone, they would have been able to expand, possibly live in these places within their country, and hopefully create new communities around the ones or within the ones that had been destroyed and hopefully rebuild this land. What do we see? Well, they now can't go to these places because they're unlivable because of how dangerous they are, because of the actions of the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, and the nature of NATO consistently pushing this conflict. On here, we see 40% more women serve in Ukraine's armed forces than in 2021. And why is this? It's because they need more fighters, and many of the times, they are conscripting people to do so. You see this online endlessly if you use things like Twitter and you stick around on the sides of Twitter that are really paying attention to the nature of all the disgusting and heinous shit that goes on with foreign policy and the inner machinations of what goes on when you're seeing the conflict that is happening across the world, whether it's in China and what was happening with the Uyghur Muslims, whether it is what's going on in Ukraine and what's happening with them fighting Russia, whether it's the process of the North Koreans and what they suffer, whether it's the North Koreans that are trying to escape and then get into China and go through places like Mongolia and travel through the desert to eventually escape the persecution that they suffered under North Korean tyranny. There's so many different things that come with this. But here, what do we see? 40% more women serve, and the reason that is like I said, it's conscription. And that is a major problem when you are conscripting the people who will be giving birth to the future generations who will then bolster the beauty of what this land has to offer to the world, which would be the nature of what their population can conjure to deliver the world. But we won't see that if we're sending 40% more of the women into the army so that they can then go die on the front lines. And it's genuinely tragic. And if you're wondering the way of how these people can escape this conflict, I made a video talking about the Volga radio signal recently that Russia has put out. I'll leave that linked right here so you can go check that out. Now let's go ahead and get into the Libertarian Institute. Former Ukrainian official says counteroffensive is a disaster. A former advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the summer counteroffensive has failed. He went on to say Kiev will never achieve its war aims of recapturing the Crimean Peninsula and restoring Ukraine's 1991 borders. In a post on X on Saturday, he said a former advisor of the officer of the president of Ukraine said Kiev made a number of mistakes during the summer's counteroffensive. He continued explaining that Ukraine has gained no territory since the end of February. He described the situation on the battlefield as a disaster. Noted that Ukraine wasted so many lives and resources and lost a strategic position in the world. He argued Western officials have used Ukraine as nothing more than a bulwark, and they have suffered a major defeat in Bakhmut, causing Kiev to lack the troops and equipment needed for the offensive. He went on to write that their mistake created a second mistake. The former aide believes Zelensky has now compounded the error in Bakhmut by failing to establish more defensive lines throughout the summer. What we see is throughout the summer, Ukrainian troops were sent into entrenched Russian territories with strong defensive positions in southern Ukraine. Kiev suffered heavy losses there, and morale among Ukrainian troops has dipped drastically. In the post, he placed the blame on Zelensky. The decision to redirect military efforts to build strategic-scale defense lines in areas could not be made by military leadership. He continued to blast Zelensky for making serious mistakes, and he said Kiev would be unable to reach its war goals. Behind the strategic mistakes in the field loom strategic mistakes in public administration, foreign and domestic policy, corruption, the real prospect of reducing aid to Ukraine, tightening the screws within the country, the destruction of relations with its closest neighbors. These are all direct results of non-military decisions made or the political decisions not made, he continued. He assesses that the war has now entered a stalemate phase. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow forces are gaining territory. Our troops are improving their position in almost all of this area, which is quite vast, he said. And here's the thing. The reason what he talks about with the stalemate is we see the fact that the bloodshed is somewhat diminished within Ukraine, And we can see that the media has stopped paying as much attention to the bloodshed in Ukraine because they're now focused on what's going on with Israel and Palestine. But the stalemate that will only consistently expand, and with it, hopefully lead to the prospect of cooler heads prevailing, which means after the winter, which Russian and Ukrainian winters are incredibly brutal, which means the conflict will be snowed in and they will be forced into a stalemate if they had not already achieved one, because they will not be able to trek all of the snow and be able to go through these intense blizzards that will be befalling this entire area. And with that, hopefully after the winter comes and we see that a new spring has arisen, they will be able to come to a peace agreement and a ceasefire that will hopefully save Ukrainian and Russian lives. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you for watching if you got this far. Do not fall for the propaganda from anyone in the war machine. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Remember that when we are caught in the fog of war, make sure to never believe absolutely everything that you are reading and never act on emotion, because it will only lead you to being someone who is easily to be propagandized. Stay lovely, stay great. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. Peace out.